Hi, everybody. Welcome. So my name is Joe Kaufeld. Thank you so much for sticking with us until the end of the night. This is going to be our last presentation, and I hope you get something out of it. This is our pro talk tonight. We're going to be covering CherryPy and specifically standing up really quick APIs, because that's what I use it for the most. I think it's really, really useful. So CherryPy is the minimalist Python web framework. So we're going to start with a little audience participation. How many of you have actually heard of CherryPy before tonight? That also answers the question. All right, so actually more than I thought. That's kind of cool. So next question is, how many of you have heard of Django? Also expected that. All right, so what we're going to do is we're going to start actually at Django and kind of work our way back so that we have a frame of reference for exactly what CherryPy is and what it can do. So Django, which you're all more familiar with, it prides itself on being an all-inclusive package. Everything that you could possibly need in order to build your application is inside the Django framework, as long as you do it the Django way, TM. So Django, it gives you everything you could possibly need. If you need a database connection, that's in there. You just got to tell it what kind of database you have. If you want basic auth, that's in there too. However, if you've ever worked with the Django application, you know that they're gigantic, and they require a lot of boilerplate in order to get really anything done. I'm actually working on a new project with a local nonprofit. We're like 17 files in, and we're not out of boilerplate yet. So on the other side of that, you have micro frameworks, which are things like CherryPy, Bottle, Flask, Web2Py, where everything happens in a single file, more or less. You can, spread it out if you really need to, but they pride themselves on giving you just what you need to succeed, and they do that in slightly different ways. For example, Flask gives you what you need, but then they also have a set of sponsored plugins for various databases and other things like that. CherryPy takes the stance where you, as the developer, know exactly what your project needs. If you need a database connection, that's great. CherryPy is not going to tell you how to do a database connection. You pick exactly what you want, and you're responsible for coding it, which we're going to get into a little bit later. But also things like, if you want auth, then you get to build it. If you want really anything spectacular, you get to build it, but you know that it's going to fit with your application. The trade-off is that CherryPy is stupid fast, to the point where it's used by a lot of really, really big companies simply because it is very good at what it does. Disney uses it, Hulu uses it, Netflix actually uses it to route traffic between data centers. Project Gutenberg uses it as their primary web server and file server. And for those of you in corporate America, Splunk Enterprise also relies heavily on CherryPy. Woo! I know, it's super exciting. So a little bit of history here. CherryPy is actually surprisingly old, and I mean that in a good way. So let's start more towards now and kind of work our way backwards. The one that you are familiar with is Django. That actually started in 2005, but didn't actually become available for public consumption until 2007. If we look at other micro frameworks, then we have Bottle coming in at 2009. Flask joined us in 2010, and so did Web2Py. Pyramid, which is closer to the Django side of things, joined us in 2010, which is based off of Pylons, which joined us in 2005. Really, the big years here are 2005 and 2010. That's where most of the cool stuff happened. CherryPy comes to us from June of 2002, where it was written by a French hacker. I'm not going to try and pronounce his name, because you don't want to hear me try. Exactly. And his goal, he's laughing because he's married to a French woman.
No, come on.
It's probably true. So he originally wrote this because he wanted something that what he felt was incredibly Pythonic, and he wanted a way to quickly write very simple web applications. And CherryPy is awesome at doing that. For point of reference, Django was actually started as a way to put news articles on the web. So it always had a larger goal, a more complex goal, which is why it is, in fact, more complex. So what we're going to do is we're going to take a look at some sample code. We're going to go through it line by line so that we can kind of walk through how CherryPy handles some stuff, what makes it a little bit different from things like Flask or other frameworks. And then we'll actually take a look at 2 different APIs of different complexities that I've written for different projects, and some of the other cool stuff that CherryPy has. So one other thing I want to touch on before we actually get into the meat of this is that if you have questions while we're going, just shoot them at me. If they get too complicated or I feel like they're going to take a little bit of time to explain, then I'll just tell you to hold on to it, and we'll cover it at the end, because we do actually have a Q&A section. So that being said, one of the things I really like about CherryPy is that it is really, really easy to get a basic server running. One of the examples that Cameron showed was 5 lines long. It is the smallest application that you can get in Flask.
One of those is only white space. 4 lines plus a blank.
5 lines long. CherryPy's smallest server is actually 6 lines long, but I think it's a little bit clearer, so let's take a look at that. This is the smallest server that you can possibly run that actually gives a valid response. It's just Python yourname.py. It's nothing fancy to actually run it. It handles everything inside. So first thing, we have import CherryPy. With CherryPy, there are no helper functions that you need to import. There's no complicated craziness with really anything. Everything is accessible under the top CherryPy object. Next thing is we have class. So every route in CherryPy is denoted by a class. So in this case, we only have one route, which is a little bit implicit, but that's okay. It's the index of the server. If you call the URL that this is hosted at, you get /, which is the index. So everything that happens is going to come under our foobar class. And that'll become a little clearer here in a bit. The next one was we have a decorator. We have CherryPy.expose. This decorator tells CherryPy that whatever method is decorated is something that the web browser can actually access. This is as much for security as it is for general code clarity, because you know just by skimming the code that anything that doesn't have CherryPy.expose is not going to be able to be accessed by the web browser. Next, we have index. Normally, the name of your function doesn't matter, unless there's only one of them, in which case index is a keyword that's actually looked for by CherryPy. For the grand majority of things that you actually use this for, it's not really important, but for here it is. And then we have our standard return, which in this case is just going to return hello world. It's going to render as a blank HTML document with the text inside. And this is where you can also put in, for example, if you're using a templating engine like Jinja 2 or something like that, then you could return a open file, or you can return a template, or a file from your local system, or whatever you want to do. It's just in the return statement. Then finally, we have CherryPy.quickstart and our foobar class. So Quickstart is actually a wrapper for the internal CherryPy HTTP engine. CherryPy has a bunch of handlers for all kinds of things. If you want to run it with uWSGI, or you want to run the basic development server, which is pretty great for pretty much for a lot of different things, actually. There's documentation for wrapping this inside of a Tornado application. I don't know why you would want to do that, but if you do want to do that, it's actually in their official documentation on how to do that. And you can also tie it directly into a Django application, or really anything you want. But Quickstart just launches CherryPy's built-in HTTP server. And it mounts the foobar class, which has our index method in it. So this is the smallest amount that we actually need in order to get text into a web browser. But since the whole point of this is to talk about APIs, then the next part that we want to change is probably to make this return JSON, because I don't know about you, but I actually really enjoy working with JSON. And so that's the next thing I'd like to change. So thankfully, we don't actually have to change very much. We just have to add one line. And all we do is we add another decorator. And I actually do want to unpack this because there's a lot going on in here. We have CherryPy.tools.json out. JSON out tells CherryPy that the index method now has the application JSON headers and that it's going to be returning something that needs to be encoded as JSON. And it has a couple other really cool things. But most importantly, it takes care of all of that for you. You don't have to think about it. The tools section, though, I want to call special attention to because the tools section is where a surprising amount of really cool stuff happens. CherryPy's tools are what you can think of as Django's middleware, if you're more familiar with that. It's anything that affects the response either before or after you're done working with it. So you can define your own tools. We're actually going to do that later because it's super easy and it's cool. But CherryPy's tools CherryPy has a lot of really awesome default tools. Things like defining a folder to upload files from or download files from. So, for example, if you're creating a server that you can download files from through HTTP, then by default, you probably want to restrict that. Like, you don't want people to be able to pull from your personal downloads folder if they're just downloading everything off of your computer. So there is a decorator, a tool decorator, that basically says, you know what? If they want to download something, that's fine, but restrict it to this particular folder. So that's an example of one. But if you notice here, we're just sending JSON out. So how many lines do you think we need to add in order to take JSON in? This is an audience participation question. It is actually one. So there is another tool for that, and this is actually mostly syntactic sugar, because you can just pull what you need out of CherryPy.request.body, but what JSON in does is it automatically grabs any JSON from the request, formats it, and attaches it to this really nice little JSON object on top of CherryPy.request. So this line, not actually required, but I just threw it in there so that you can see what it looks like if you want to interact with it. So it's also a really easy way to check to see if someone sent you JSON. So I know that working with users is a glorious experience, and they always read documentation. So you never really know if you're going to get JSON to a JSON-only endpoint. Thankfully, what you can do is add into those parentheses on JSON in force equals true or false. By default, it is true. It does force that there will be JSON there. But if you tell it to not force JSON, then if JSON isn't in the request, it won't put on the JSON object here. So you can just check to see if it has attribute JSON CherryPy.request, and you can see very quickly whether or not the user actually sent you the stuff that they were supposed to send you. So that's kind of nice. I really like that. So that's the end of my slides. So I figured what we could do now is actually take a look at some real code, some actual production level code that we are running with similar syntax, a little bit more complicated, but some other cool things that CherryPy has to offer.
I have a question.
Okay, I may or may not have an answer.
So with the decorators you just put on there,
yeah,
does that change the behavior, whether it's a get, a post, or a put?
No, but there are decorators for that. So actually, thank you, because I was going to talk on that a little bit later, but I'll touch on it now. So there are two different ways that you can route things, and there is a little bit more complexity here that I will touch on in a second, but there are essentially two major ways that you can do it. You can either let CherryPy figure out what you're requesting and just let it do all of the routing, which is what we're doing here, or you can tell it exactly what to accept. So, for example, in the second example, we have a piece that is only accept, post, and get to this particular response. Or, under the class, if you name the function all caps with the type of request, so get, put, delete, post, whatever, then CherryPy will look for those functions, and it will choose that as the routing for that particular request, and it'll just handle it all for you. So, good? Yeah. All right, so what we're going to look at here is called, let's see, is it Command-Shift-B? No. Yeah, I'm working on that. I'm working on that. Okay. So, doop. I can actually go larger. All right. There we go. OK, so what we're going to do is we're going to take a step through this. What this is, that's OK. Just caught me off guard. So what this is it's actually a heartbeat server for a couple of bots that I run. It starts up with the bot and picks a port within a specific range so that if I issue a GET request to that port, then it gives me the running information of that bot. So I know that A, it is running, and B, what versions everything is running with. So it's not tremendously large. We are going to ignore the Tor core config line because that is something. I'm sorry? Different Tor. So we're going to ignore this line because it's actually part of the global or larger bot scheme. But I want to call your attention to the configuration option. So CherryPy has two different types of configs. You have an application level config, which is everything relating to routing, mostly. It's things like here, where we're manually changing headers, or if we want to define a directory for all of our static assets, or a route for that, or something like that. That's where this happens. The other configuration option is the global config, which is things like, what HTTP server do we use? What port do we run on? That kind of thing. So for this, what we're doing is we have the /, which tells us that this particular piece is index only. There's no special routing. There's no really funny business on here. It's just everything is on the index route. So for the index route, we have a couple of rules. The first one is request.dispatch, which tells CherryPy that instead of actually figuring out where to go manually, just letting it know that, hey, we have some rules in here that actually do our own routing. So you don't need to handle that for us. Just let me do the routing, and we'll be cool. The second one is a subsection of tools where CherryPy does this really nice thing where most of the time you don't actually need all of the headers that are part of the request. Sometimes you do, and sometimes you don't. So CherryPy kind of helps you by squashing them down if you don't need them. So for this, we are explicitly saying, please give me all of the headers. And then the third one is we are explicitly replacing that header, for the response with application type content JSON, or content type application JSON.
Isn't that default, though, using the JSON in or JSON out?
It is, but this is clearer for actually showing how this works. So that you can do this if you need to. JSON in, JSON out, as Calvin pointed out, does automatically handle this for you. I also wrote this 8 months ago, so who the hell knows what I was actually thinking when I wrote this. So we have our configuration object, and remember this because this will become important later at the bottom of the file. We're going to skip past all this documentation because nobody reads that anyway. And we get to our actual class. So just like we have before, we have a single class that, in this case, it's called Heartbeat because that's what we're doing. And this one works a little bit differently. So like we mentioned earlier with Calvin's first question, we see we have function get here. So this only responds to get requests. This doesn't care if you throw anything else at it. In fact, it will explode in a glorious fashion. But if you send it a get request, you'll actually get what you're looking for. You can also see we moved the location of CherryPy.expose. So normally, if you've got helper functions, or if you've got an actual complex class, then you don't want to put CherryPy.expose on top of the class itself, because that will expose everything that's under that class. Here, we know exactly what's there, so why not? Also, if we have other functions here like post or put or delete or whatever, then it's easier if we know that everything that's under that class can be accessed by the browser to just put a single CherryPy.expose over the class instead of over all 4 or however many individual methods you have.
I have a question.
Okay.
I'm sorry.
It's okay.
I don't want to be difficult. That's not very PEP8 compliant with the lowercase h on the heartbeat. Is this case sensitive to the URL?
No.
So why did you make it lowercase?
Because I wrote this 8 months ago.
Okay, sorry.
Actually, I will touch on that in the second example.
Okay.
So,
During my talk, and I had a lot of that too. It makes sense during mine. So.
it's okay. We'll get there. Okay, so next part is actually starting the thing. So before in the slides we looked at CherryPy.Quickstart, but here we're actually going to break that out into the individual pieces. So the first is CherryPy.Tree.Amount, and just this part is actually super cool because CherryPy structures URLs like a metaphorical tree. You have the index, which is the trunk, and then all of the possible routes spread outwards from there. And that allows you to do some really cool things, because the tree function has a couple of really neat methods. The first one is mount. So that is that we take our heartbeat function, or our heartbeat class, and...
That's the problem right there.
Yeah, I know, we're getting there. And we assign it to index, to the root of the server. We're also going to pass in the configuration object so that it has all of those extra rules that we defined up top. So yes, this totally could be capitalized. It really doesn't matter. But next, we're going to look at CherryPy.Socket, server.socket host. This is where you would put the actual URL that this is running at. So this is more of a security piece. For this, I have actually changed it back to localhost. But if you are running it accessible to the public, then this is where you would set your URL. And then we have CherryPy engine start. So Quickstart that we saw earlier is basically syntactic sugar for 3 lines. We have CherryPy engine start, CherryPy engine block, and CherryPy engine stop. So start is pretty self-explanatory. It spins up everything, gets the port number, sets all your defaults, all that good stuff. Then you have an option, depending on what exactly you want your server to do. If you want it to be blocking, then you can call CherryPy engine block, and it will handle all of that for you. If you don't want it to be blocking, which in this case we do not, then simply omit that line, and it'll just keep chugging along. Last thing down here is CherryPy engine exit, which is syntactic sugar over CherryPy engine stop, which simply closes everything and then stops the program, as opposed to simply closing the HTTP server. So all of the code, before I forget, all of the code for this and the next example, there will be links to that in the IndyPy presentations repo, github.com/IndyPy/IndyPy presentations. That's where all of my slides and links to this code is going to be. So you should check that out because it's really cool. So that's our more simple application of a generic API. The slightly more complex version is this one, where we're actually not going to look at everything because, frankly, we'd be here for a little while. But there are a couple things specifically that I want to point out. The first one is, remember how I mentioned in the very beginning where if you want to make it happen, CherryPy assumes that you are the best person to know how that should happen, including your own database connections? So this would have been a great opportunity to use SQL Alchemy, which is what I did not do. Instead, I wrote an entire handler for exactly what I wanted to use a SQLite database for, and then that is all of this. Yeah, down to 154. So this is essentially just a tool for me to use inside my application. CherryPy doesn't care that this exists, but I just wanted to point that out as more of a, CherryPy does not have an option for this. It's not included. It's never going to be included because you are the person who is responsible for making that happen. We also have a tools thing, which we're going to skip over because this is just all internal stuff that I don't need. But this we care about. So I mentioned CherryPy's tools options and how you can actually make your own. So this is a decorator builder for CherryPy. We have tools.register. And then we actually have a little string. So in this case, before handler. CherryPy offers 8 different hooks where you can insert this code as a decorator. So if you've got, for example, if you want to be able to interact with the request as soon as the application gets it, before even CherryPy does any of its normal stuff, then you can set that as where it's registered, as the register point. In this case, before handler is run this code right before it gets to the function, excuse me, that this is decorating. Because frankly, that's really all we need. However, the hooks actually go all the way to after the request or after the response has been sent back to the client. If there's anything else you want to do before actually finalizing the process, you can even put a tool there as well. So what this looks like is we don't really need any of this because all of this is just declaring stuff that we worked on above. But what we're doing here is we're looking for an API key in the JSON for the request. So when CherryPy handles this, again, this is a lot like middleware. So as long as it doesn't explode, CherryPy assumes that everything went well and you're good to go. So for this, we have basically checked to make sure that not only do we have a key that the database says that the admin flag is checked for that key. This also has a complete implementation for API keys, but that's not part of the talk, so you know, whatever. So if it does have a key, but it doesn't have the admin flag set, then we have CherryPy.http error, which is the same thing as Django's HTTP response object, more or less. And this raises a error code for the browser, which then filters all the way back up, and it doesn't run the code that this is decorating, which is kind of the goal. We do kind of the same thing here, just a little less complicated because all we need to do is make sure that we have the API key in place. And this one actually has an implicit return. It returns none if it doesn't explode. So CherryPy then takes that as a yes, this succeeded, and we can continue on. So one of the things that Calvin brought up was routing. And again, we're going to skip past all the documentation. Before I get to routing, because I almost forgot about this, this is what it looks like when you declare your own tool. So it's just available as another decorator as part of the standard CherryPy.tools suite, which also means that if you have a set of decorators that you really enjoy using and you find yourself using them on project after project, you can just import everything in a file as a CherryPy toolbox is what they're called. And then you can always have them available as part of the tools object. What?
I'm sorry, you said to ask questions.
I did. What's up?
Is it required, as of this version of CherryPy, to use type hinting? Because I noticed you're using the Python 3 type hints.
No. It's not even in the documentation to use type hinting. It is a personal choice of mine.
Okay, I wondered about that.
Because other people are working on this as well.
Okay.
And the people who are working on this, we have about 8 people who contribute to this particular code base, and they are of wildly varying skill levels.
Yeah, it might be important to repeat the question.
It might be important to repeat the question. The question was, is it required to use Python 3's type hinting like I'm doing for a lot of these methods? And the answer is no, it is not required. But I do it simply because I think it's really, really awesome. And if you need any arguments on why type hinting should be right for you, come talk to me afterwards because I'm a fan.
Or what type hinting might even
Or
be.
what type hinting might even be, I guess. You know, we'll cover that later.
Yeah, that's a big topic. Sorry.
That's okay.
I apologize. You brought this on yourself.
I did bring this on myself. Okay, so you also asked about allowing specific methods. So this is the tool that actually allows you to set which methods can come to a specific method, which HTTP method can come to a specific Python method. So we're going to scroll way the hell down here because this is something that I really wanted to touch on. When you actually get to routing, when you get to having more than one thing that you want to actually have accessible from the web server, then in Django, you actually have to write out all of those URLs. That's something that's always bugged me personally. I think it's kind of a waste of time. But the way that CherryPy works is, in this case, we have API, which is our server root. You can think of that as /. So everything that we add to the server root becomes its routing command. We're actually building the control flow for the application in this section. So /API.claim then becomes URL/claim. And when you navigate to /claim in the browser, then it's going to be calling the posts class and the claim method. If you navigate to /done, api.done, then it will call the class posts method done, and so on and so forth. We actually get down here, we use the index method because that's the only one that users has. So API/user will call the users class and the index method. And you can stack them. So in this case, we have what will become /keys, but this one doesn't actually return anything. Everything important is at /keys/me, or keys/create/keys/revoke. So just by adding these onto the base API object, then you can get as crazy as you want, but this is your URL routing. And you can actually do some really cool stuff with this that we don't have time for, which is very unfortunate. So we're back to the actual mounting for the CherryPy tree, and this is one of the really cool things about the mount object, is that we're taking the API object and all of the rules that we just defined, and we're saying, put that on server root. But if we have another fully fleshed out CherryPy server with its own complete ecosystem application, maybe it's a single page application for something else, then we can say cherrypy.tree.graft that application onto this other URL or this other route. So we can take as many freestanding CherryPy applications and we can put them all on the same URL routing tree, and CherryPy will handle all of that for us. We don't actually have to do any kind of special routing shenanigans. It'll just send it to the right place. We define socket host again, and we start the engine, and we're off to the races. So with that, it is 8:50, and that's pretty much all I had. So thank you guys for listening. I really appreciate it, and I hope you learned something. So questions?
Yeah, we definitely have time for questions.
So you're instantiating the API here.
Yeah.
Do you need to build the API all in one go, or can you mount like an API onto another API, say like you're building up the tree?
Well, if you can repeat the question, that'd be wonderful.
So like,
No, not you.
No, that's for me so that I can get it on the recording. So the question was, do you have to build the API all in one go, or can you graft things on before the server starts? Okay. The answer is yes. You can do it both ways, realistically. It's easier to build it all at once. You cannot do that to the best of my knowledge. You cannot build it after the service starts.
So
because
once the mount happens, it's done?
Once the server starts, it's done. So mount the tree mount, then you can run you can run a modification on the tree after you mount API, or you can add it as a route for the API object. It doesn't really matter. The important part is the engine start. And in this case, we are using the built-in HTTP CherryPy engine. So if we were using uWSGI, for example, then it would still have to happen before uWSGI is called in order for those routes to take effect. Cool? Yeah.
Awesome. Another question here.
You mentioned at the beginning that CherryPy was really fast.
Mm-hmm.
Do you know of any benchmarks or ways to back up that claim relative to other Python frameworks or other languages?
The relative speed of CherryPy versus other web servers, I do not have any numbers in front of me. I know that there are I came across a fair number of independent anecdotal studies. To the best of my knowledge, there are no official numbers that say, for example, this particular web server implemented the same way in X framework versus Y framework, besides what's found on a couple people's blogs. What I do know is that it's good enough for Netflix, so it's good enough for me. Shoot.
Have you used other micro web frameworks in Python besides Cherry and Django?
Yes, I've used Flask before for personal projects. And I've also used, are we talking about specifically micro frameworks or just general Python frameworks?
You were able to talk about your experience using something like Bottle and CherryPy, or maybe something like InDodo.
Okay, well, definitely I can't talk about Node because I have absolutely zero experience with that. But in reference to other frameworks that I've used, my day job is actually mostly Django. So that's what I'm more familiar with from a professional standpoint. From a personal standpoint, CherryPy is what I do most of my projects in, although with Flask, the biggest reason that I prefer CherryPy is that there are a number of abstractions that CherryPy provides over Flask. So for example, CherryPy makes a really easy distinction between the request object and the response object, which is something I had trouble with in Flask. I don't know why, but I did. The other thing is that CherryPy offers a very extensive configuration system. Not only, like as we showed up top, not only can you configure by individual route, you can also set in, global settings, or global level settings versus application settings. If you're running two different applications on the same global server, you can set those independently if you really want to. And the defaults for the configurations are actually really nice. You'll notice here at the bottom, even though we've got this gigantic file here, we're actually not passing in our own config object because the defaults are good enough that I don't actually have to change anything here. So it's going to throw up a little notice when I start the server saying, hey, by the way, we didn't get a config object, so we're just going to start with the basics. But the basics are good enough for a lot of projects. So, good? I saw a camera next.
So, just going off of what you said about config, I didn't notice that you weren't passing config object, which is a pretty big deal compared to this class. Mm-hmm. But this is the same application where you did that giant mess of DB stuff.
No. Oh, yes, sorry. The giant mess of DB stuff, yes, that is in this application.
Is there a simple, like, is there a CherryPy SQL kind of plugin that you can just throw middleware over that you can throw in here? Or is that always something that you have to do?
To the best of my knowledge, it is always something that you have to deal with. However, the easier way to do this would have just been using SQL Alchemy and just using the ORM that SQL Alchemy allows you. I took the deliberate hard route because I wanted to do it for the fun of it. But yes, if there are no real plugins for CherryPy except ones that other people have written, in that they're just toolbox pieces. So no official plugins like Flask.
Felix had a question over there.
I was just curious at a high level, so I saw you were putting your Json in and Json out decorators for most of your endpoint classes and functions. But you also declared that in your configuration. I'm curious, is that necessary when you configure that stuff on a default global level?
It is not necessary in the first example. So the first example is the only one that we set a configuration in. And for this, we could just probably nuke this and it would be totally fine. But we have it and it works, so I'm not changing it. But yeah, in this case, it is not necessary. If we were
tests, right?
Say what?
You've got tests.
Yes, for this one I do.
So you could just take it out and run tests.
For the larger API, that is still an alpha. We don't have quite a full test suite yet.
That's why it's still an alpha, is because we don't have our test suite.
Yeah, the only thing that you would really need the configuration object for is if you're if you are butchering the headers beyond what they need to be, or serving files generally from a static directory. For that, you definitely need a configuration object. There are other things that you can do with routing in the configuration object, but nothing here is that complex. Yo.
In your example where you assemble that tree, how do you handle dynamic resource identifiers? Because any API or any complexity,
Like
always
args
have
to those
segments
things.
that are dynamic IDs. So,
Yeah, so the question was, how do we handle dynamic URL pieces? And CherryPy actually has a really elegant way of doing that that is not particularly relevant to this particular API, where it allows you to have a specific dispatch method inside of the class. So let's say for user, if we wanted to do API.user and be able to pass in, for example, URL/user/name, and be able to grab the name off of the URL, then in the user class, there's a specific function called dunder cp dispatch. And what that does is gives you access to the full URL string before CherryPy does anything with the actual request. So you can interact with all of the items on the URL path, save them into the request, and be able to interact with them as variables afterwards. And you can do that no matter where wherever the piece of the URL that you're looking for is located inside the URL. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, but so that means we have to do a lot of boilerplate every time compared to like class or know where you assemble the part and specify if it's passed as well.
If you want to do it that way, yes, you would have to type it out each time. There is a new method in the newer version or in one of the latest versions of CherryPy that I haven't had a chance to play with yet, but I have read about it, where you can do, I think it's cherrypy.path.pop as a decorator over the class, and that automatically grabs whatever item you pop out and saves it to an item inside the request object. And that's just a decorator on top of the class. But I haven't played with that one yet, so you're better off looking inside the documentation for that.
Awesome. Let's give Joe a big round of applause.